today we're going to just have a conversation that we're recording and we put up on the web. If some of you have been here before, I ask the same 10 questions. And then what's interesting, I hope, over time is seeing how the different poets respond to the 10 questions. And so some of the questions you might not like, or people have objected, and that's really...
Do they refuse? Like,
sometimes, yeah, or that's what we do use some stupid questions.
We are.
You can. And also you can... The audience can interrupt at any time and ask a question or for clarification or more. And so that's the way it's going to go. And I just want to introduce Matao couldn't come today because he's in Libya. He's going to Libya on a plane. Good excuse. And so we have Aimee Nezhukumatathil.
That's fine.
At home I say it. And then Jennifer Chang. So Jennifer has a book, The History of Anonymity, and Aimee has 3 books, Lucky Fish, Miracle Fruit, and At the Drive-In Volcano. And we're really happy to have them here. So I'm just going to get started with the first question. So the first question is, what does it mean to make a poem?
It's funny because I have a poem that ends with what does it even mean to write a poem today? And
that's your last line?
It's a series of questions. Like, what does it even mean to write a poem today? It means I want to correct my mistakes. It means I don't want to be lonely. And I read it recently, and when I read it, it became really real to me because I feel like just as a person and a person who asks a lot of questions, poems seem to provide a space to answer them and provide a space in which I can encounter a potential reader, or potential intimate, or potential audience. It means not wanting to be lonely. So desire to make a voice is also desire to find an interlocutor.
Wow, that's great.
I'm transcribing this down. I remember being a little kid and reading, and when you read, it was like the world got bigger and you had a friend, and there's something about writing poems that speaks to that original love of reading too. Like you don't want to be quiet or alone.
There's also the actual pure creation kind of aspect of it too, where it's like, you know, it's that thing like remembering things. For me, it's like it's also too remembering things I didn't know I knew or that I had forgotten, kind of in some ways as well. So I look at it as the maker aspect of it, creating something there on the page, but also as a way of preservation and curation, kind of like a museum curator, kind of in some ways, of collecting, I don't know, little oddities. For now, anyway, collecting oddities of nature, you know, that kind of thing, getting them on the page before they disappear. So for me, in some ways too, playing with the creation of sound, playing with the creation of image, but kind of making sure that these things get in print, things that I haven't seen in print before. So things like a half Filipino Indian, you know, walking down the street. I had never seen that before, ever, in a book, and I think that world, my world, would have been expanded had I known there was someone else.
I thought that's true about your poems because I'm always discovering something that I never knew before, and I love that aspect of it.
Like the rabbit outside your poem.
The pygmy rabbit, yeah.
Oh God,
that's nice. Yeah. And that was actually, so one of the things I say about my book is, you know, I fudge with human relationships all the time, you know, so some of my students are like, did you date this person? Or, you know, that kind of thing. I've mentioned I have a daughter before, and I don't have a daughter. But with the science, like with the nature facts, for lack of a better word, they're all heavily researched. I do like pretty extensive research, be it traveling to an aquarium and talking with like a curator of whales, you know, the person who's in charge of the whale sharks in North America, just to get like one line or one detail. I mean, I'll do pages of notes, but maybe one line will make it in, that kind of thing. So that's one thing that I'm actually proud of. Like, you don't trust anything like human per se, but anything with plants, animals, anything like that, that's all fact. I'm not just like, I'm going to make up a mouse today and call it a pygmy mouse or something, you know. That, if there's a flower that eats, or that eats, maybe not people per se, because that's folklore, but there is a flower that is 9 feet tall. That's not just poet's imagination, that kind of thing.
Great. Okay, so the next question is, what is the role of beauty in a poem? And you can talk about in general or just your own work.
I'm not really sure what I would qualify as beauty. What do you think, Aimee?
Beauty can be, that's one of those words though that can be what's beautiful to one person is pure terror and ugliness for somebody else, Maybe delight is another word maybe that I'd use. The delight in sound, the delight in image. But again, that even is also one of those words, what's delightful to one person.
Can you ask the question again?
What is the role of beauty in a poem? People hate this question.
It's a difficult question because it's owes society a certain responsibility to the poem.
Yeah.
Is the poem supposed to be beautiful? Is beauty an image or is it an experience? Is it the encounter on a page or?
Is it just the writing of the poem itself?
Yeah.
Or something?
It's a variation on your first question because why am I making this poem? Is it to create a beautiful object or is it to create some kind of social or cultural moment? And I don't know. I don't think consciously about beauty when I write. I actually, sometimes when I'm writing, I'm just aiming to stop thinking entirely and to listen to the music of the language rather than listen to the noise of my head or the noise of the world that surrounds me. But beauty's tough. I do think consciously when I'm revising.
Yeah, I was gonna say
I want
revision.
I want this to sound good.
Yeah, I was gonna say I almost never think of it in the actual writing of the poems, but in revision, I do actually think about that. And I think maybe kind of it coincided in some ways when I had my sons, kind of in some way. The same year I had my eldest was also a year that there was like crazy, and maybe it was just media, I don't know, slow summer or just somehow crazy focus. That was also the summer of just crazy kidnappings and murders of young girls, just left and right. And then here I was bringing this little boy into the world, and it was almost like frantic and furious. My friends were like, why are you still writing? Because I was writing like 2 days after I gave birth. And they're not like, I wouldn't even call them like done poems. There's still a lot that I'm still kind of,
You know what it is? There's an intense desire for beauty. Like I wish this were beautiful. I wish life would be more beautiful. And Wallace Stevens says death is the mother of beauty. And it sounds like almost from that frantic anxiety.
Yeah, it was frantic. It was almost
that
there
needs to be. There's something about the poem and the making of the poem that aims for the desire for beauty. But I don't think it's conscious.
It's not, definitely not conscious. I didn't sit down and say, I have to write this beautiful poem, for my sons. But at the same time, I also felt it was a different shift in what details I'm including, what details I'm taking out, and also what subject matter I'm tackling, kind of in some ways. So I like that. I like that you mentioned that. Death is the mother of beauty.
This is so interesting because I think both of your work is so beautiful. Like I feel like that's one of the things that I would say to describe. But it's interesting to hear you say that you're not thinking about that.
I think it would be too much pressure.
Yeah, right. I think you're right. Like here I am, beauty factory.
Exactly, and especially in those early days too, when my shoulder has spit up on it, I have applesauce on my hair, my hair is on top of my head. Hard to be like, okay, now I'm the bringer of beauty. Hard to do that at 4 in the morning. I had small little moments of time. Definitely the revision process.
Well, this sort of ties into maybe the revision process. The next question is, how do sound and vision, maybe the image, I guess is what I mean, intersect in your poems?
We were listening to the recording today. You asked that question. I was like, what is you talking about?
But
we've cheated. We talked about this.
Oh, man. This is the problem with the internet.
You gave us the link.
Yeah.
You said heads up. It's better than just sitting there like, what do you think? No, what do you think?
Yeah, what do you think?
The funny thing is, even though we saw this, we still didn't have a big
You're putting our
answer.
makeup on. In a booty.
This is probably the only two pairs of poets we were applying lipstick while we were talking, while we were listening to the previous interviews. So. It's the truth. We're keeping it real. We're keeping it real. But okay, so but I would say an answer. We didn't come up with an answer, but I would say too just in terms of like influence. I think it's huge image in terms of marrying line and sound was Lucille Clifton for me. I guess some people read E.E. Cummings beforehand. I didn't know who E.E. Cummings was. So for me, Lucille having that little eye and the short kind of narrow lines, there was so much silence and so much, like that was almost an image. The silence was almost image, and the white space on the page was almost as important almost as the words itself. So for me, and that's very different from what I write, but I like having that in the back of my mind just to show like the power of what a silence can do, and the power of, say, zero, or the power of lowercase. I don't know, she's just like one of the fiercest poets on the page for me, which is kind of weird if you look at her poems on the page. They're tiny, tiny little breaths of poems, but they pack such a punch. So it's almost like a primer on how to study the line if you read Lucille Clifton's poems, I think. I don't know.
Yeah, it's funny because I've been talking about this a lot in the class I'm teaching on contemporary poetry, and this week we were looking at Seamus Heaney and Charles Wright, and he has, in his Nobel lecture, he starts with the story of his boyhood, and it's a story of living in a 3-room house and the house being filled with noise. And the noise was his parents talking the local accents, it was the sound of his brothers and sisters, it was the radio, it was nature coming in from outside, like birds and water. And one thing that we were thinking about was how all these sounds have to somehow, because it was, he called it as a pre-literate moment. And so all these sounds, like one thing that he's aimed to do is make these sounds into something that's linguistic, visual, recognizable, because you can't see a sound, right? And we were looking at Homage to Paul Cézanne, that amazing Charles Wright poem from the 70s, and we were looking at that against various still lifes and landscapes by Cézanne, and how different the poem was from Cézanne. So how is this an homage? How is this an homage? And one student said, well, he keeps describing the dead, and the dead are so noisy. They're making so much noise, and there's so much repetition, and there's so much echoing. And the thing that we arrived at, and it started becoming a very trippy class, because we started talking about, like, we have to see what we can't see. And what Cézanne's doing in his paintings, he's trying to paint the reduced structure, or just the shapes. And he's trying to stop seeing what he's seeing in front of him and seeing what's behind, what we can't see, the invisible. So at one point the students were like, can you smoke pot now? No. So, I mean, there's something about the invisibility of sound and the sightedness of the visual image, and they have to somehow meet. And the challenge of that poem is figuring out, like, how are these images of the dead, the noises that they make, how they also, the landscape that you see, or the still life. And still life too is, in French, it's la nature morte, which is literally dead nature. That was something that we were trying to figure out. And that's not really a good answer to your question, but it seems like a constant quarrel between sound and vision, the image of the poem on the page. And that poem too, it's so structured. It's like 8 sections of 16 lines, but each section uses those 16 lines differently. Whether it's couplets or quatrains.
So that's visual too, like that choice.
Absolutely, yeah. The scene keeps shifting. It's like each page you turn, it's a different image, but it's the same image. And it keeps sounding differently, but echoing at the same time.
I think that's an excellent answer. If you listen to
Not bad for, no, it's good.
This is just, we're shifting gears a little bit here, so this is coming from another point of view. What was the first poem you ever wrote, and what were the circumstances?
Oh my gosh. Well, there's always the, like, kind of first, I don't know, like, total ridiculous kid poem, and then the first, like, I don't know, quasi-grown-up poem. I mean, the first thing I remember kind of making or writing, I mean, it was a haiku. That was, in elementary school when we did our week-long unit on the haiku, and it was ridiculous. It was like rainbows and unicorns, the stuff of the 80s that all girls loved. I think the word glitter was in there. Glitter, unicorns, rainbows. So that's that. But I remember thinking that if there was a conscious moment that I was like, I can actually create the stuff that I'm reading, like that kind of thing. So that was a moment. I mean, the content was ridiculous, but that was at least the first, and maybe that was like, for second or third grade. But I was actually a chemistry major throughout most of really until my junior year in college at Ohio State. And the long and short of it, Jennifer, I know it's heard this story so much, so I'm going to distill it down.
When I heard it, so I don't remember it. I'm sorry,
It makes it sound like I tell this story at a bar, and I don't. The long and short of it is I was a fledgling chemistry major at Ohio State, and I was struggling over whatever organic chem lab that night. And someone in our honor study lounge had left a poem on the study table. I didn't know it was a poem. This is how bad my high school kind of,
What's wrong with that writing?
And it was a prose poem when I came to find out it was a prose poem. But I was so blown away with it. It is that whole Emily Dickinson adage, but the top of my head felt like it was cut off, essentially. Like, I guess after just years of intense concentration on chemical equations and formulas and burning things with a Bunsen burner, this was just, it was so stunning. So I tacked up, like, whose handout is this? What is this? Please see Aimee in room, whatever. The guy down the hall whose poem it was came up to my door and was saying, yeah, this is a poem, It's mine. Honest to goodness, I did not know what it was. It was a prose poem, so I thought it didn't sound like a story, but I had no words for it, And so I begged him, can I please come to your, whatever class this is? I just want to see, just to sit in the back. And so he did. He let me. I asked the teacher, do you mind? I won't say a word. I just want to sit in the back. And it was a poetry workshop. It was the equivalent of an intermediate poetry workshop with David Satina, who's not here anymore, but he used to teach. He used to direct the program at Ohio State. And bless his heart, like, he indulged. I didn't know that there was a world where you could create poetry. I didn't know there was a world where you could study it either as well. And it ended up being a poem by Naomi Shihab Nye.
Oh.
It was a prose poem called Mid Snowball. And so it was that next week, I switched from chemistry to English, just on that one poem. So I didn't. I finished out the rest of the semester, that kind of thing. It just really felt like, someone like pulling off the tablecloth for me. But I had to face my folks that summer, when I came home, and I was destined and prepped to be the next female doctor in the family. My mom is a doctor. So the stuff hit the fan when I, for lack of a more poetic way of talking about it. I mean, my parents wept when I told them. I can laugh about it now, but there was open weeping and yelling about, what are you doing? You're an honors chemistry student.
Is that your first rebellion?
Yeah, pretty much. I was walking on the wild side there. I know.
Good choice.
But to my parents, this was everything. To my parents, this was everything. My mother and father both, it was like the kind of the classic like immigrant kind of thing. They came here to like hope that their kids would, either follow in their footsteps or just, that kind of thing. And now, fast forward, they're ridiculous. They're like my biggest fans, and anytime anything happens, they'll be the first to, they're retired now in Florida, and they'll bring my book to, bingo meetings and stuff like that. They'll post news about me. They'll cut out little clippings and post it on their, their house association bulletin board. I mean, it's so, but there was definite weeping, and I think they just didn't understand too, like what, they knew, I think, poets existed, but in the same way that doily makers existed, you know, like, they're out there, they've just never met one before.
Not in my family.
Exactly, yeah, not in my family,
Yeah.
not in my family, right, yeah.
They're out there,
Exactly.
but why?
That's exactly it.
I never heard that story before.
Oh, you didn't? Okay.
But I have seen your parents before, and I never told you this story. But one of the first readings we did together before we were friends was at the Asian American Writers Workshop. And your parents had come, and after the reading, they were sitting behind me, and they were like, Aimee was the best one.
But see now, and I laughed at, but that I still remember sitting in our living room. It was our grave, formal living room, sitting them down, and it was as if I had told them, you know, like, I've decided to become a professional, like, serial killer. And it was weeping. So that's okay. I didn't know that either.
Yeah, it's something I've always remembered. I never told you about it.
So I came late, you know, to this, and I feel like I still, you know, all the people in workshop were always so much better read than me and that kind of thing. But that, I mean, I spent my evenings in the stacks reading, and I still am reading. I never really left campus. So yeah, I think that was the best way for me to kind of get to it. And I still love reading about science. I still love, you know, most of the stuff I read is biology or, you know, nonfiction, science nonfiction. But yeah, so it was relatively late in my academic career. How about you? What was the first?
I mean, it's.
Did you start off as English studying?
I did. Well, college is really a blur.
So I take it your first rebellion wasn't switching
No,
majors?
it wasn't. I was terrible. I was a terror as a child. But we grew up in a really wooded area, and I spent a lot of time. You know, if I wasn't in the woods and playing outside, I was looking out the window and like looking at the trees. Like, it was fascinating. This was one big oak tree that was like right parallel to my window. My parents had cut it down recently. So it was almost like writing was part of that engagement. So I think one of my first poems was about a caterpillar.
So cute.
And we had poems in the house. My grandfather was a philosophy professor, and when he died, we took a lot of his books home. And one was The World's Best Poems by Mark Van Doren. And I remember opening it up and finding Heinrich Heine in the Germany chapter, and you know, the trees were talking to each other. So this really spoke to me, and I was probably about 10, and it just seemed like, okay, so what did I do today? I went and played in the yard, and I would write like, you know, the grass is green, caterpillars, the sky. I love everything.
But you were recording it.
I was recording. I was documenting what I saw.
It's like early field notes or something.
Yeah,
like that.
exactly. And I feel like I hadn't diverged that far from that subject matter. I still write about the same things. And it didn't occur to me to study poetry. So when I went to college, I thought I was going to be a classics major, but the classes were too early in the morning. I didn't do well my first year, and then I tried, you know, like political philosophy. I didn't understand that at all. And then I took a contemporary poetry class, and it was taught by Robert von Hallberg, and I took it because I thought it would be easy. Because I was like, oh, it's contemporary literature, so it's not going to be complicated. And it was at 2 o'clock, so it was like perfect. But he has a beautiful sonorous reading voice, and he read Meditation at Lagunitas by Robert Haas, and you know, I melted, or I died, and even now, like, when I read that poem out loud, when I hear it read, and it's one of the most, I have the most like, almost a primal reaction to it, you know, a word is elegy to what it signifies, like that just sends chills, that means everything to me in some ways. And I just, you know, I proceeded to take more poetry classes. I did better, you know, part of it was just I was attentive in these courses in a way I wasn't in any other place in my life. And I had a wonderful teacher, Elizabeth Alexander, and for a workshop, and it was right when National Poetry Month started. And she had, you know, she said, "What do you do? How do you celebrate poetry?" And you know, my friend Jenny and I went out and started asking people, "Where do you find poems?" And this is like Southside Chicago. We just like went out to random people and asked them, like, "What's poetry to you?" And you know, I still feel that kind of like enchantment with it, like the possibility that anyone can find poetry anywhere. There's a poem for everyone that will convert them. Like there was a poem for you.
Yeah, I love this conversation like that, because I mean, like you feel insane when that happens, when you have the poem. My friends know, like, I read a poem, my body falls apart. Yeah. They're like, oh, shoot, that's a good poem, and you're having that reaction. But I mean, that's really magical.
Meditation, like Anita's, was an early one for me too. Yeah, it's funny that they're both prose poems. Mint Snowball was a prose poem.
Oh, it's like it's lineated.
Oh yeah. I just on the page in my anthology, I'm thinking of like the block.
Yeah, it's in one block east and
Okay, so here's a question that I always ask everybody, which is to talk about translation, and because some of our poets who come do translation, but you could also talk about translation of experience into language too. I mean, you don't have to talk about actual translations, or you can. And some people say they hate translations. We've had lots of different answers.
Do they hate translating or they hate reading translations?
They hate reading. I forget. Yeah, I think it was Jericho said they hate translations.
I'm kind of neutral. Very neutral. I can't help but mention my friend Paula Go, who has a book of translations coming out.
Oh, is it?
English to English translations of Aimee
Nezhukumatathil.
Wow. Can you explain that to people? Because that's a little bit.
I don't know how to explain it.
English to English translations.
That's what I'm talking about. But I mean, I've seen him practice some of his translation techniques, and one is playing a telephone, and you whisper Gibson's poems into someone's ear and passes around the room and how it ends.
And does he transcribe it?
Yeah, but some of them are just like, I woke up today and life sucks. Or,
I see. Right.
So is that be it?
It's sort of like translating Dickinson and Paul Legault speak. Like he's translating. It's like a practice of reading almost. Because he's reading Dickinson, then he writes like sort of what that experience is.
It's almost like he takes the veil off.
Yeah.
Like he takes out the all the figures of speech and just says, the sun is death. I'm not, like, I'm gonna die.
They're very funny.
Is it out already or no?
It's coming out soon, yeah. But I don't know. I mean, I like the magic of translations. They're talking about magic and enchantment. There's something wonderful about the possibility of one thing becoming something else, and it's still being the same. It's still being constituted of the same materials in a sense.
I mean, there is something too about. I keep coming back to that. What you were saying about. Poetry is making your world larger in some ways, and you know, I mean, that's really what it comes down to it for me, is when I read a translation in a language that I know I would never had normally kind of ever tackled myself or gone out and researched on my own or that kind of thing. I feel like, I'm so grateful. It's very rare. I can't even think of a time where I'm like, I wasted my time. It's almost like gifts in some ways, in a way that a regular poem is not. It's almost like a gift from the translator, but also a gift from this poet, and it puts the onus on me, like, how did I not know this other poet existed from around the other side of the world? Like, I'm mad at myself.
Yeah, it's a cultural encounter. I wish Colin were here.
I know, he would have a better answer.
Because now he's translating from Arabic into English and English into Arabic.
Exactly.
Or then he was saying, well, yeah, at dinner that he was translating Lynn and Ginny and
Carol
Crochet
Crochet.
into Arabic, which is so interesting.
Yeah, it's almost like, it's not just cultural encounter, it's also like a form of liberation, you know, or a passport for Carol Crochet and Virginian or Libyan poetry into America. It's suddenly there's just, everything's more free. But I mean, I guess I understand Jericho's reservations.
Yeah, there's just, I mean, now I feel like he's going to get mad at me that I think, but the conversation was more about the impossibility, I think, if I remember right, of that, like, and just this, you know, and there's something, really something to that. It's like, how can you, really translate?
I think that's one of the appeals of translation. I mean, one of my best friends is a translator of Spanish poetry, and I think he really loves that impossibility. It's like you're constantly
once you embrace that, once you embrace them, then you can go forward with it. I don't know. I'm so grateful when I come across a translated poem, and they're like almost little gifts, you know. And just for that, I'm grateful to have my my repertoire. I mean, I think that I'm always that. I still am that. Young undergrad who's sitting in the stacks of the library, researching things that I didn't know, poets that I didn't know. So, in some ways, translation is I think more necessary now more than ever. When I'm teaching, my students who are very much blue collar, south of Buffalo, to make them see like, hey, this young adult in Iraq is the same as me. We have this, or it's like this universal thing. It's only through poetry that they would get that, that, and they're not reading news, or some of them are not reading news, some of them are not taking the time to, know about other cultures, but to get that distilled in one poem for that one moment, I'm so grateful for that.
Just to imagine American poetry without, the encounter of Rilke, or George Trakl, or Czesław Miłosz. Like, there's so many poets that we would be so undernourished in our poetics without their
influence.
Yeah, without their influence.
The next question is to talk about frustration and the time when you experienced, if you ever have experienced the failure of language. Which,
every day. Right now.
Just another day in the life. Failure of language. I'd say 9 times out of 10 it's failure of language when they get to the writing, but that's kind of also the excitement too. So the excitement, say 9 times I'm not exactly getting to the core of what I thought or whatever, that kind of thing, it's not working. That 10th time where everything clicks and you forget you're writing, you get into that kind of moment where you're almost on autopilot and things are actually working, you don't feel like deleting or scratching out, makes me coming back, for more, that kind of thing. So, I mean, I think I've also embraced it. I'm assuming that when I sit down to write, nothing's, I take that pressure off. I have to, though. If I have that pressure, like, I need to draft a completed poem, I would never write again. But it's that I love the trying, the business of trying. Failure of language for subject matter, it's happening kind of recently. It used to be like, I can write a poem, almost about anything, or at least a draft, that kind of thing. Right now, some of the stuff I'm working on is to distill it down, just subject matters. It's hard for me to kind of find words on this subject, and it's the sex trafficking in India for girls, and it's hard to get it in a poem. I'm personally devastated by it, and in ways that, not that I hadn't been personally devastated by other subject matters, but I'm finding it harder to write poems. I'm writing essays, it's hard for me to get into a poem.
Interesting.
I find
what is it? Could you say something about that? Because that's always interesting.
Sure.
This new form is kind of, it's working maybe with the essay, but.
Yeah, kind of. I don't know exactly what it is. It's like poem-y, essay things, whatever. I have a poem in here called Birth Geographic, and it was meant as a poem initially, but it's in Best American Essays, so or notable in Best American Essays. So I can kind of see it as both, but I didn't intend to say, hey, I'm going to do an essay now. It's and birth was another subject in some ways too. I feel like when something is, I haven't even fully articulated, it's such a great question. But I feel like too, when it's, when there's something attacking with the sex trafficking in India, I also feel a responsibility in ways like, I don't want to, I don't know, exploit victims in some ways.
It's not art.
It's not, yeah, and I feel like I want to record it, the truth of it as close as I can. And that's where the essay is coming through for me more. I don't know if that makes sense.
No,
in
it
some
does,
ways,
because I
but-
think always in a poem there's that option of this isn't true. Like,
Yeah,
that it's
yeah.
like you don't trust
And I
what
want
it
it to be
is.
true. I want it to almost be like slamming the reader in the face, like, this is not a poet's whimsy, this is not for dramatic effect in some ways. Although, you're right, I mean, an essay, of course, every decision you make in an essay is also for dramatic effect, but I also want that veil to be lifted off and say that this happens, this is not, there's no question in the reader's mind, you know, that kind of thing. So, maybe that, at least recently for me, that's the first thing I thought of when you asked that question. I don't know, for you, Jen?
Yeah, I don't really know how to answer it because I feel like it's such a, it's so integral to my writing process. And I've talked about this with other writers where, you know, you have some writers who talk about how great it feels to be writing, they write constantly. And for me, it's a really difficult process to write. You know, sometimes I'll go days or weeks without writing because it almost hurts. You know, it hurts to
It hurts to write or hurts not to write? Or
it
both
hurts
kinds?
both. It,
Yeah.
both. It hurts not to write, and it hurts to write.
Yeah.
And it's painful. And I'm also, you know, working on dissertations, so I find myself going back and forth, and the genre switching to is something that I find is very much married with the kind of subject matter I want to write about. So there's a lot of stuff I feel like I can't write in poems, and I don't know why I can't. But I find writing difficult, really difficult, and I think it's important to say that because I think the assumption is that if you're a poet, it's just
Everything is
all
magic.
I'm writing a poem in my head right now, and it's just not magic. it's really.
Or the friends, the well-meaning friends who are like, you should write a poem about that tonight. You know,
yeah,
something in the news. You should write a poem about that.
I can do that. It's a really difficult process, and part of it is because, you know, you want to discover something new. You also need to find the language is necessary.
Yeah.
And often when you're just writing in your room, it's just not necessary, or it's just like you're trying to compel yourself into a state of naturalness, and it doesn't happen easily. And inspiration is not abundant. Even when I feel this urgent need to answer questions about, you know, things that bother me, or life, or nature, or, you know, literature, or whatever.
I have a point. Oh, sorry.
go ahead, no.
What's your dissertation? What are you working on?
It's on
Caterpillars.
It's on caterpillars. No, it's on pastoral. I'm writing about pastoral as a framework for thinking and writing about race and cultural differences in American modernism. So,
Isn't that awesome? I love that. I just want it to be done. I know, because
I want it to be done. Yeah, I do. I'll let you know when it's done.
What advice would you give high school students who want to write poetry?
Just do it.
Yeah,
High school's a good time for poetry because you just think of it as play. Don't you? You're less confined by knowledge.
I think so, less confined by knowledge, but also, I think there's also more pressure, though, of what people think around you in high school now. So that's at play. On the one hand, they're so free, like you're private in some ways, but it's almost like a secret, kind of, because it's not cool, or for some people it's not cool to write, you know. I visit high schools a lot, and I find it very much 50-50. The people who just fully embrace it, and who, but they're kind of the artistic kind of, you know, ones who listen to the beat of their own drum, and the ones who kind of are interested, but they would never let on because they're a football player, or whatever, you know, that kind of thing, stereotypical. So I find that it's 50-50. But I think just being even observant and open to the world, I think if you can get high school students to do that and to unplug, and to not feel like you need to update your status on every event, you know, I think that's huge, right? I mean, just to be open and to be out in the world, I think too, to be open, so that, you know, that can encompass everything. Open to other cultures, open to nature, open to just having genuine kind of conversation and interaction without like, oh, now I got a blog about this conversation, you know, that kind of thing. Just even in the last 10 years, I found like, oh, something good happens, I've got to tweet it, you know, that kind of thing. And for high school students, a lot of it is kind of getting them to notice the magic that's around them and getting to the page, you know, not to broadcast. I mean, in some ways you could say, oh, but they're writing too, but they're poems, right?
Yeah.
Well, that's very exterior and immediate reflection, whereas poetry is so interior, and then you never know if anybody's going to read it.
Exactly.
Yeah, and what you're saying, it makes me think about this essay I read a few years ago in the American Scholar called "The End of Solitude" by William Deresiewicz, and he writes about how young people are no longer alone, they no longer spend time
And alone is a bad thing. Right?
They're always in groups, they're always in Facebook, Twitter, and I almost feel like poetry should be a requirement, and that the kids should write a poem once a week and see what it's like to be alone for half an hour in your own thoughts.
To daydream, even too. I mean, I'm so adamant about, I'm trying to, you know, avoid it as much as possible, but just long car trips. Both my husband and I actually had childhoods like this, where we didn't have a gadget or a movie in front of us on a long car trip. We had to make fun or games with our brother or sister, and we had to daydream. We had to actually look out the window and notice things. And who knows, maybe ask me in 4 or 5 years if I'm still the same way, but I'm very adamant about making at least space, giving my son space to daydream and not have, oh, I have to go to this practice or do this, that kind of thing. They could be alone and wander the backyard and investigate a tulip.
My friend, I used to babysit her kids, and this is Lisa, and she would have quiet time. Like, let's have quiet time now. And they all just like sit quietly. And, like, they could be writing poems. They could be just looking out the window. And they were teenagers.
Oh, great. And that's even harder to do.
Yeah.
Yeah, just having that quiet time and not having a negative connotation to it.
Yeah. I mean, I talk about this with my college students. I insist, because of what poems do and the process it takes to make a poem, there's something inherently countercultural about poetry that like can't be lost. You have to make time for the poem because it's a different rhythm, it's a different space.
Yeah, you can't just read the poem 2 minutes before class and be ready, you know, that kind of thing. I tell my students that all the time. Just unplugging, I think, for high school students.
And for us.
Yeah.
I kind of check my texts.
Someone's tweeting about this in the audience. You're very meta. I don't tweet.
Switching gears again, so there's this famous line by Adorno, which is, to write a poem after Auschwitz is barbaric, and then this was countered by Jerome Rothenberg, who said, after Auschwitz there is only poetry. So is there anything, you kind of talked about this a little bit earlier, is there anything that poetry can't approach, you know, that you feel like shouldn't be the subject of a poem?
I don't think so. I've used that quotation with my students, and their first reaction is, no, there has to be poetry. Like, what are you supposed to do after something? Like there was Rothenberg. But Adorno retracts that. He also
does. Yeah, I know, it's not fair. Sorry. But he does retract it.
Yeah, and he also writes elsewhere that in lyric poetry is a dream of a world in which things might be different. And for that reason, isn't that wonderful? And it's a sort of definition of lyric poetry that I always turn to. If things are made differently, anything has to be attempted. Like, I think your project on sex trafficking in India, that sounds so necessary. You know, it sounds like you're driven to it.
Because it's draining. But I keep coming back to it. You're right. It's so necessary.
And that's what brings us to poems. We're so preoccupied. We're troubled into speech. But I can't imagine. I don't know. Is there a poem that you can't write?
Actually, even Khalid mentioned it a little bit, that I don't think he even knew that he could write Aimee, and I'm butchering the title. I can't remember what the title is. The Libya poem after Gaddafi. Was it called?
He referred to it as his Gaddafi poem.
Yeah.
My Gaddafi poem.
But it only could have been written after Gaddafi was killed, and only at that point in time for him, that kind of thing. And I think, and he even said he resisted it before, like, I'm not going to write about this. I can't write about this then, But then even he said, okay, finally, I was able to break through and find it at that moment, and thank goodness he did. So yeah, my easy answer would be,
Well, it's funny because he said, I can't do that, I can't write about events.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
interesting because there's this whole history of people writing poems.
Sure,
That was our job.
Yeah.
Who's got to write a poem about it?
Yeah, okay, occasional, even just like occasional poetry in general, right? Yeah.
And I think the key word too is barbaric. Barbarism is sort of corrupted, messed up language, and poetry seems to respond to that. It's sort of the exact opposite of barbarism. We're idealistic.
Hopeful. Okay, well, only 2 more questions. What are you guys working on now? What's the future of your poetry?
Future of, oh gosh, I mean, well, this endless collection of essays that I have everybody wants to know what type of essays are you writing, that kind of
lyric
thing.
essays? Can we use that word for it? Or?
I don't know, there's always some weird connotations with that, like, oh, that's so precious, and it might as well be poems, that kind of thing. But then I've also had them published as, they're in like a nature essay kind of section. So whatever hybrid, lyric, nature, even a tiny bit personal, excuse me, personal essays. So I don't even know, see, I can't even talk. Personal essays, like really poems. That's what I'm working on endlessly. I'm not really working on poems right now. Or maybe these are, I don't know. But about sex, the sex trafficking and the horrors and the aftermath of that. It's devastating, brutal writing, and even on a good kind of writing day, that kind of thing, I feel so emotionally drained in ways, and I don't mean to make it be like, oh, look at my life, it's so hard, but it is, and then I come out to like my 2 young kids, and then I think, oh, I have to get this down again, you know what I mean? So yeah, it's emotionally draining and difficult things to research and to interview people in ways that I've never encountered before. But I also feel like, in some ways that I'm born to do this in that way. I mean, the people that I've talked to or interviewed, it's just it's a great connection. I've been making really great, just human connections with people from all over the world. So that's been awesome. In ways that poetry is so usually interior for me and such a solitary process. So I'm grateful for that kind of human kind of connection in some ways too. I almost need it with the subject matter.
Yeah.
I think I would crumble if I was just pursuing this all on my own, with no help. So it's difficult. And then approaching like glorious summer days and watching a magnolia bloom outside to see all this beauty around you, and then to be writing really kind of horrific, barbaric kind of situations. Difficult, yeah. Kind of a cheerier answer than that, but.
I'm so proud of you. That's wonderful. We've known each other for a while now. It's always fascinating to hear what you're working on. I'm not really working on anything. I mean, I recently completed a manuscript for a second book, and I read some poems from that last night, mostly poems from that last night.
What is the title again? I love it. It's the Romeo and Juliet.
Some Say the Lark.
Some Say the Lark. I love that.
And I think it's done. Today I think it's done.
Tomorrow I'm
I'm finishing my dissertation. I also write review essays, so that's something that I'm thinking about doing. I don't know. Right now I'm just trying to live my life, and I'm getting married this summer, so I'm not thinking about language.
But you are.
I am. Yeah. I mean, I think I was explaining this to someone at my department at school, and I was just saying, like, I'm in this quiet interlude because I've completed this big project. in the midst of this other big project, which is my dissertation, which will want to be my first academic book. But I feel very mindful. You know, it's at the end of a yoga practice. You just want to absorb what has just happened. And I feel like I'm in that quiet interlude where I'm attendant to the possibilities, but not eager for them either. So I'm waiting without any activity to it. It's an inactive waiting.
Okay, last question. What can we do to make, if anything, to make poetry just more prevalent in America, like just more people knowing about poetry? Or should we not? Is everything right this way and should people not? You know what I mean? Richard Howard had this thing a long time ago where he was like, poets shouldn't be paid. Well, it's easy for him to say. But yeah. So, you know, any thoughts? Like, what can we?
I mean, I think just initially too, I'm a big believer of poetry in the schools, starting that way, and kind of demystifying poetry kind of right away. I mean, I was so pleased to see, who's that little kid, Nathan, at the poetry reading last night, you know, to know that he has a father who brings him to poetry readings, you know, I would have loved that. I didn't even know that that was even a possibility. And even through high school, our creative writing classes were for people who were not in the AP track or not honors. That was basically for people who were going into trade school, essentially, you know. So it was like, who would want to do creative writing? It was so ostracized and weird thinking. So now, I mean, I do, April is a big time for me. I go into schools a lot, and it's stunning. I mean, it's really, poets are kids. I mean, kids are, they have so much that they have that mindfulness already. You don't have to teach them that mindfulness. It's where do they lose it? Where do they start losing it and think, I have no time for this anymore, or you know, that kind of thing. How to keep that alive? And again, they don't need to be poets, but just to have that appreciation. So that reading a poem, you know, I don't know, during the quiet time is not a weird thing. You know, that's just part of. That's just like kind of, you know, that's just an everyday occurrence.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. I think it should be something that's sort of everyday. I think it should be prevalent. And, you know, I think a great example is after 9/11, so many people turned to poetry. They turned to Auden, they turned to Whitman. And I think we all need it more than is realized. And for me, I don't really know how to do it. And, you know, I just try to teach it well. Like, I was just at this conference, and the keynote speaker said that teaching is a political act. And, you know, I mean, I teach poetry, but it's important to me that I'm teaching it in a way that people can take it, that my students can take it with them into the world, and they can read poems and read poems with other people. Not necessarily become poets, but be readers.
Just to have it in their hands.
And be cultural consumers of a culture that's more than just easily digestible. And
I tell my students, like, do not sell your literature books back. It is not worth it to get, you know, like the $2 back. And it's like, you don't want to be that 30-something-year-old who has nothing on the bookshelves but Blu-rays and DVDs, you know. Maybe one copy of The Hunger Games or something. Keep your homework, keep your anthologies. Like, that's the stuff that you can pull down to.
That's your nourishment.
I shame them into not, you know, like, you do not want to be like, you will be judged from, you know, future partners when they walk into your house. Any partner worth their salt will look at your bookshelves, and if they see nothing but Adam Sandler DVDs.
This is exactly what we should all do. We should start shaming people. Be like, you're not shaming things.
You know,
one day.
They listen, and it's true. And then I run into, you know, I live in a small town, and I run into students, like, you know, 5, 6, 7 years later, and they're like, I still have my books. And that's the thing, it's not, how are you? Oh, I hear you're a mom now. It's, I have my books. That's a victory. That's a political act to have your books. You know,
to care about it in a public way. I mean, and just like, and when I write, I don't ever want to write a poem that is so inaccessible that it alienates the reader. And I do care about being understood by my parents. You know, they're immigrants. Like, they don't read poetry naturally. It's weird for them to read my poems too. I don't want them to ever to be unable to read. And my mom's a great reader, but you know, she'll read Jane Austen, but she can never understand James Joyce because of the language barrier. And I don't ever want to have a barrier where I can't read these poems. Like I want my mom to be able to read my poems and understand them at least at a surface level.
Okay, well that's it. Thank you very much.